From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Before we get started, a warning. Today's episode deals with issues around suicide and firearm violence. Over the past decade, Colorado has seen more than 7,000 deaths by suicide that involved a firearm. And according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, guns are involved in more than half of Colorado's deaths by suicide. A bill making its way through the state legislature could help reduce those numbers. The proposal would allow Coloradans to place a voluntary freeze on their own access to buy a gun. Someone who's concerned about their mental health could add their own name to a database of people who are ineligible to purchase a firearm. If approved, the bill would make Colorado the fifth state to set up what's known as a do not sell registry. So how effective are voluntary programs like this at reducing the risk of suicide with a firearm? To learn more, we're talking with two of our KUNC colleagues, Chaz Sisk with the Colorado Capital News Alliance, and Lee Patterson, an editor and reporter who covers mental health and has extensively reported on firearms as well. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Hey there, Erin.
Lee, this registry is the latest proposal from lawmakers to help reduce the number of gun deaths in Colorado. It would allow a person to voluntarily limit their access to buying a gun. Why do proponents say this approach is worth trying?
I think because when it comes to firearm suicide, we do know that time and distance matters. So research shows that these very serious thoughts of self-harm can come on quickly. The argument is that when someone is in a mental health crisis, preventing them from having immediate access to a gun can be life-saving. The focus here is on guns because it is the most lethal method of self-harm by far.
Chaz, let's talk about the basics of this registry. As mentioned, it's a voluntary program. You don't need a court order or a doctor's note to sign up. How do people place their names on the list?
Well, this is a pretty new idea. So far, 4 states have done this. Those states are Washington, Utah, Virginia, and Delaware. As you might imagine, they've all done it a little bit differently. What they're talking about in Colorado is setting up an online portal that would be operated by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and it would connect with the National Background Check database, where it would be put alongside things like a red flag warning or any other kind of flag on a person's ability to buy a gun.
Now, Chaz, you talked with a psychiatric nurse practitioner in Fort Collins who is an advocate for this bill. Why does she feel so strongly that this is needed here in Colorado?
Yeah, I mean, she had multiple experiences that raised her awareness about the risk of suicide and wanted to do something about it. She had served in the Navy and had seen the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder on people who are veterans. She's also worked with youth and college students, and she told me one story in particular about a student she had worked with who had been in crisis, seemed to be doing better, but then took a downward turn and traveled to Wyoming and very much on the spur of the moment purchased a gun and took his own life. And that really prompted her to want to do something about it. So she contacted her state lawmaker, a lawmaker here in Fort Collins, and began to advocate for this piece of legislation.
And again, just a warning to listeners, we're talking about suicide and violence involving firearms. Chaz, Colorado's proposal is based on a national campaign called Donna's Law. What evidence do we have this tactic works to prevent gun deaths?
Well, about this particular tactic, really not a lot of evidence. It is hard to know whether it works because it is such a new idea. It's only been a couple of years since the first state adopted this. I did ask how many people have taken part in this, and really it's only in the few hundred so far have signed up for this do not sell registry. It is totally voluntary. That's one interesting thing about it. And so it does depend on someone being in a mental place to want to give up their gun. So what they're doing is they anticipate the way this being used is encouraging people who are in recovery or maybe have a history of suicidal ideation for those people to put themselves on the registry while they're in a place where they're thinking about that sort of thing.
Lee, you have done quite a bit of reporting and research into mental health. How does this compare with other voluntary programs around firearms?
Yeah, so I think that gun owners have been keeping each other safe for a long time. Part of gun owning culture, at least in some communities, is to, for example, say to your friend who's maybe going through a rough divorce, like, hey, let me hold on to your guns for the month until you're feeling better. That sort of thing.
Right.
In recent years, this type of voluntary storage has become a bit more formalized. Now, some gun shops and sheriff's departments will store people's guns for a period of time if they're not doing so well. I remember several years back, I was in Craig, Colorado, reporting on this topic. I interviewed a man whose wife had died by firearm suicide. That night, the police and the victim advocate showed up and they asked him, hey, do you have any guns? We'd like to hold on to them for a while. You know, we need to protect you from yourself tonight. And in retrospect, he told me like it was a really good idea getting the guns out of the house. So I think that's one example of how voluntary gun safety has been an element and part of gun culture for a long time.
How realistic is it to expect someone in a mental health crisis to take a pause and make themselves ineligible to buy a gun, Lee?
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, with my previous example, there were community members involved. So this is hard to say. It's a case-by-case basis kind of thing. I can imagine a scenario where it might need to be a family member or a friend or a neighbor suggesting to someone, hey, there's this do not sell list. Like, let's talk about it. Maybe let's, sit down and look at the website. I think if someone is in a serious mental health crisis, they might not be thinking clearly and might not know they need to help themselves. I suspect that community will need to be involved in order for this to be effective.
Gun safety measures are tricky to pass because of the Second Amendment. Chaz, as you look at this bill's chances in the Colorado legislature, how likely is it to pass?
I think it's pretty likely to pass, and that's because it doesn't raise as many constitutional issues as other gun safety measures might raise. It is a situation where a person is voluntarily saying, I don't want a gun, as opposed to someone else ordering them not to have a gun. Also, I would say that it's had bipartisan support in most states where it's been introduced. There's even a bill in Congress to take it national that is bipartisan.
Okay.
So there is some Republican support for these things. On the other hand, so far we are seeing some opposition from Republican lawmakers and from gun rights groups like the Rocky Mountain gun owners. So there's a possibility it could be derailed, but this is a legislature that has been very responsive to gun safety measures, so I think it's quite likely to pass.
And this is an interesting proposal because it kind of mixes gun safety, which is usually thought of as a progressive cause, with personal responsibility, which is more of a conservative or libertarian value. Lee, what kind of momentum have you seen on bipartisan gun safety measures like this?
Yeah, well, I think we know that gun control measures over the years in Colorado have been extremely controversial. Lawmakers have been recalled over gun control.
Right.
This measure is different because the do not sell registry is voluntary. I think that is an element that might speak to gun owners and make this a bit more politically palatable.
Lee Patterson and Chaz Sisk, thank you both so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
My pleasure.
By the way, budget analysts at the state capitol say the cost to create a Colorado do not sell registry would be minimal, about $200,000 to set it up. Proponents hope those costs would be funded by donations. KUNC News will keep you posted on the status of the bill as it moves through the legislature. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.